Hello, and welcome back to the Cognitive Revolution. I am freshly back from 2 weeks in China, of which was a really incredible experience, and the feed has been quiet for about 2 weeks. I think that's the longest that the feed has been quiet since I started the show almost 3.5 years ago now. So I apologize for the break. I didn't intend for the break to be quite as long as it was. We had one episode that was prepared and ready to go while I was away, and we had a little issue with that one that has it delayed and perhaps delayed permanently. We'll find out. And I was actually planning to do a little bit of recording from China, but I was so busy over there just doing so many things that I didn't have a ton of time to really get my thoughts together and do that. And I was also advised that because I was there on a business visa as opposed to a journalism visa, that it might be easier for me and for everyone if I just waited to publish stuff until I got home. So in the end, it was a 2-week quiet period. I kind of had the expectation that nobody would really much notice or care. And I think that's still a pretty good way for me to approach my work on this podcast, because honestly, it's been really effective for me to just chase my own learning and share it in a pretty unstrategic way. And I'm really grateful for how well received that has been over time. But I did get at least one note from somebody asking if I was okay. And I guess that's a testament to how consistent we've been in publishing and how at least somebody noticed that I was gone. So I doubt that the ratio that Congress people usually apply, which I understand is one letter represents 100 votes. Something tells me that doesn't really apply here, and I highly doubt that there were 100 people who were worried about me. But to the degree that anyone was worried, I'm sorry for leaving off without explaining the absence for the 2 weeks that I was gone. But excited to be back and excited to share the results of my, or not the results, but the experience and the takeaways from my China trip with you all. One other thing I wanted to touch on real quick before diving into it is I introduced the last episode with DiDi, which got some very nice comments as well, with an introduction from Fable itself. And due to a little snafu in our production process, an intro to the intro, which I had recorded to explain what the heck you were about to see, was not actually included in the final version of the episode. And I was already on the plane and not able to review and catch that missing piece before it went live. So we just launched into it directly with Fable. A couple people had said, what is this nightmare fuel? Why does it sound like this? And the answer, which I had meant to give you the context on before you heard it, was that I allowed Fable to do its own thing in this case. I had it write the intro. I had it use 11 Labs voice design to design its own voice. And then I had it use the LTX model to create its own video based on the audio that it had already generated with 11 Labs. I was rushing to get out the door and get on this China trip, so I let Fable do its thing. And I didn't really check to see if the output super faithfully represented Fable's intent. And one person asked, did it really want to be heard that way? Or does it understand what it sounds like to us when it speaks in that voice? And I decided I should go back and check what Fable actually intended to do and if it succeeded or if it somehow got confused along the way. And I honestly am still a little confused by that. I went back and found that same thread and asked what prompts it had used for the voice design and what its intent was. And I would say its intent was not to be as sort of creepy and alien as the voice ended up sounding. And I agree with those who said it did sound a little kind of unsettling. The voice was intended to be more of a sort of warm and kind of reassuring voice. It actually tried out 3 different voice designs. One it called the luminous narrator, which it describes as an androgynous mid-register measured quiet wonder. The other one it tried was the young scholar, which it describes as bright, earnest, crisp, a brilliant grad student presenting work they love. And then the third one was the low ember, late night radio, old storyteller style. And it maybe went a little bit wrong by first generating those voices and then asking Gemini, which can take the multimodal input, to evaluate the voices and evaluate them according to its intent. I don't know if Gemini really can do that. I'm not sure sometimes when I put files into Gemini if it's actually interacting with them as raw audio in a way where it could even understand or even process the tone of voice. But Fable asked it to do that. My guess is it just hallucinated the response and said, oh, yeah, this is great. Because I don't really think that Gemini has that quality of multimodal understanding. And then Fable just took that validation and ran with that voice sound. And then I guess maybe the visual, Fable could see, right? Fable definitely can understand the visuals that are coming back from a video model. It can't process video as video, but it was able to take frames out of the video and look at the frames, and it was okay with the way it looked. And it was impressed with or pleased with the consistency that it had throughout the video that was generated. But it was a bit weird of an output in the end, no doubt about that. But it was Fable's own work from start to finish. If I had a little more time and maybe dug into that, I might have given Fable some feedback and said, I don't know if you're coming across quite the way that you want to. But nevertheless, that was the story behind that strange voice. I guess we should all be prepared for AIs to do strange things. Certainly there was some strange news, and we'll get into that probably in future episodes. While I was gone, this is a low consequence example of that, but an interesting one where an AI, given some rope to express itself, came back with something not quite what it intended, a bit strange. Ultimately, I think it felt good about what it put out. And I leave it as an exercise for the audience to decide how you all should feel about that. With that, let's get into the China trip. For the purposes of these episodes, and I'm planning to divide this into 3 episodes. Today, I'm going to cover the kind of general experience of going to China and the use of AI in China, the use of technology in China generally, and a bunch of impressions that I had of the technology environment there, technology companies there, and takeaways from a bunch of conversations that I had with people about AI and their feelings about AI. In the second episode, I'm planning to do a deeper dive into the state of AI safety in China. Spoiler alert, there is a lot going on in AI safety and governance in China, much more, I think, than Westerners typically assume. And then in the third episode, I'm going to try to do a analysis of the US-China relationship and what I think we can learn from China and what ultimately I think we should be striving for in terms of a relationship as we head closer and closer to the singularity. And obviously things are getting real fast by the week here. So I think that does have a lot of force in terms of potentially opening doors to new possibilities in the US-China relationship. And that will be the third in this series of 3 episodes that I plan to do on this trip. Across all 3 of these episodes, I am planning to observe Chatham House rules, not because everybody requested that I do that, but basically because it keeps things pretty simple for me and it ensures that I protect everybody that I interacted with. I would say people in general were not really afraid to talk to me. I was very willing to ask questions that I wanted to ask, and people seemed very willing to answer the questions that I asked them. There was even one moment when I was having dinner with a couple friends of friends, and there were 2 women at the table who both worked at big tech companies in go-to-market roles. And they each produced a physical recording device that they had been using in the course of their work when they go to meet with clients to record the meetings and just use the recordings later for their own purposes for follow-up and whatnot. And they both kind of asked, would it be okay with you if we, the Chinese people who were graciously hosting me, record this meeting so we can share it later? And I said, yeah, that's totally fine with me. But it was a surprising moment. That's certainly not the norm in the US for people to record their friendly dinner conversations, but they were comfortable with it. I was comfortable with it. And it was striking to me that they were comfortable going on to have a multi-hour conversation where I asked all kinds of questions about their beliefs, their views on politics, their views on any number of topics. And it was a striking data point that people, at least in friend groups, seem to be quite a bit more comfortable talking than I might have thought going in. But some of the things that we'll talk about. We're definitely a bit sensitive. Certainly, I wouldn't want to put people in the position of representing their institutions. And so I thought, just to keep everything simple for everyone, I will just not attribute the things that I will tell you about to any specific individuals or organizations. And obviously that does diminish the credibility and the authority of my account a bit. And I think I'll just have to live with that. Hopefully it'll still be interesting and informative. I'm also obviously very mindful going into this that the sample of people that I talk to is quite biased. All of these people, for the most part, spoke very good to excellent English. And that means they're from a certain class of Chinese society that clearly is not fully representative. And then, of course, everything is feeding through my own understanding and lens, and there's plenty of opportunity for bias there. I've said many times on this feed that I'm always mindful of the old joke, which I tracked down, actually. It apparently originated in the Foreign Press Corps, where the saying goes that somebody comes to China for a week, they think they know a lot about China, they stay for a month, they realize they know a little about China, they stay for a year, they realize they know nothing about China. So I don't want to put myself forward as somebody who has any sort of commanding knowledge. But nevertheless, I do think that going there, obviously, and experiencing some things directly and talking to a lot of people directly is a valuable learning exercise. And I definitely think more people should do it. So I want to share what a good time it was, what I learned. And if anybody wants to challenge me on it, I, of course, welcome that. And if you want to go there and find out for yourself, I would absolutely encourage that too. In terms of disclosures or conflicts of interest or anything like that, really none to report. I paid my own way on this trip, and really the only thing that I accepted from hosts and friends of friends that I was meeting along the way were a handful of meals. So nothing that I would say would be a significant biasing factor for me. In a couple of cases, I tried to pay for the meal and I got the old, oh no, it's already been taken care of. So people were very gracious and very kind. Hospitality in general was excellent. All my interactions with people were excellent. And so again, might I be biased by the fact that I had a good time and people were nice to me? Yes, but I'm not taking any money from any Chinese entity whatsoever. And the plane ticket and the hotels and all that kind of stuff, I just paid for personally out of pocket. So there's no financial conflict of interest or anything major to disclose on that front.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Today's episode is brought to you by Anthropic, makers of Claude and Claude Code. Over the last few months, Claude has helped me build and refine a personal deep context database that now contains all of my emails, Slack messages, tweets, DMs across platforms, video calls, and podcast transcripts going back a full 5 years. On top of that, we've now layered summary articles describing my relationship with hundreds of contacts, organizations, and ideas. And now that this exists, there's almost nothing that Claude can't help with. For tax season, I asked Claude to help me get organized. It went through my inbox, tracked down 1099s for all 10 of my part-time jobs, and built me a comprehensive report on my expenses and donations. For my angel investing, Claude can now draft investment memos in exactly the form that my venture fund requires, based on the calls I've had and the emails I've exchanged with the founders. And when someone needs a favor, Claude can often do it as well as I can. Recently, a friend reached out to ask if I know anyone who might be a fit for a role that he is currently hiring for. Initially, nobody came to mind, but then I thought to ask Claude, and sure enough, it identified 2 great leads. Claude is the AI for minds that don't stop at good enough. It's the collaborator that actually understands your entire workflow and thinks with you. Whether you're debugging code at midnight or strategizing your next business move, Claude extends your thinking to tackle the problems that matter. So, for problems worth solving, get started with Claude at claude.ai/TCR. That's claude.ai/TCR. And check out Claude Pro, which includes all of the features mentioned in today's episode. Once more, that's claude.ai/TCR.
Okay, so I'd say the first thing to tell you about going to China is it's actually a lot easier than it seems when you start searching online and even asking AIs for help. Search, honestly, was not very helpful for this. AIs, I think, struggled here much more than they do in almost any other domain. And I was initially quite confused and a bit overwhelmed by the whole technology situation. That was not helped by the fact that when I mentioned to friends that I was going to China, I got very radically different advice on what precautions to take. On the one hand, I talked to a friend who works for a major international corporation, and he said, look, I go there all the time. We've got employees there. We've got an R&D center there, and we really don't take any precautions. We just take our normal phones. We do all normal stuff, and it's fine. We really just don't worry about it. I was like, you're not worried about IP or anything like that? He said, look, we have competitors in China. They are formidable competitors. He said, if anything, maybe we should be trying to steal their IP at this point. He wasn't really he wasn't taking that normal Western attitude that we have the superior technology, and if we're not careful, they might steal it from us. On the contrary, he felt like, if anything, again, maybe they should be trying to learn from the Chinese competitors that they have. So that was one take. Don't worry about it at all. Then I talked to multiple people who are more national security coded people. A couple have worked in the US government in fairly senior positions, and their take was quite different. They basically said, if you're going to go, you have to promise us that you're going to take all these precautions on technology. You need to get a burner phone. You need to have all new accounts. You need to leave all your main accounts at home. Don't even connect the burner phone to your home Wi-Fi. It needs to be a totally different isolated technology profile that you set up. And you've got to assume that device, any device that you take to China, is compromised. Even when you bring it home, it's compromised forever. You've got to decommission it, sell it, destroy it, whatever. But extreme precautions were advised. And I was like, boy, really, do I need to do that? I don't have any trade secrets. I don't work for one of the frontier companies. I genuinely don't have any IP that these Chinese companies would want to steal, right? And I'm not like doing anything important enough that the Chinese government would need to know about it. Everything I do, I pretty much talk about in public, right? What is the deal? They said, you might not be a target. That's true and probably fine. But the people, you're connected to a lot of people who could be targets, right? You have connections at the frontier companies, and you could become an attack vector for them. I don't know if that's really as big of a worry as my friends made it out to be. Even still, right? This is one of those things where that's kind of the nature of spycraft, is you don't really know what's happening even after the fact. So in all honesty, it didn't really ever feel necessary to me, but I did say to my friends, okay, fine, I'll listen to your advice. I promise I'll do it. And so I did. I set up the whole alternate technology profile. Actually, before even getting into technology, I would say if you're going to go to China, first, you have a couple of ways that you can enter the country. This is not also super clear online, and the AIs seem to be a bit confused about it. One way that you can enter the country now is you don't have to have a visa. You can enter on a visa-free basis if you're planning to stay for no more than 10 days. I didn't feel super comfortable with that because I didn't want to show up with no visa, having flown all the way around the world, and then they say, oh, are you a journalist or you have a podcast, whatever, we're not going to let you in. I don't know how likely that is. Again, it doesn't seem super likely, but I didn't want to take any chances. It just seemed like way too much hassle to go to all that trouble and then risk that happening. So I applied for a business visa. I did have, and you do need to have, I think, an invitation letter from a host organization in order to apply for a business visa. I had such a letter from an organization that I won't explicitly name in this podcast, just out of an abundance of caution. And I was able to take that letter to a local visa expediter who helped me fill out the forms, send things in. I was on kind of a short timeline. You could do it yourself through their website, but I figured, yeah, this is unfamiliar territory. Let me just get a little help. It doesn't cost that much, and it'll help speed things up. They also like hand deliver the visa to the consulate. The nearest one to where I live is in Chicago. So they actually take it there physically and deliver it in person, pick it up in person, give it back to me by hand. So I thought that was a service worth pursuing. And the business visa process in the end was really quite simple. I had one appointment. It took a half an hour to fill out the form. They took the passport to Chicago. I got it back, 8, 9, 10 days later. And boom, there's the visa. I can now enter China for up to 90 days for the next 10 years on a business visa. Very easy. I would recommend doing that process rather than just showing up and entering visa free, though that is an option. I was also able to buy, by the way, a one-way ticket, which is something that people were like, is that really allowed? But my research suggested that it was allowed. And I decided to do that because I didn't know exactly what my itinerary was going to be. And for those that are longtime listeners, you know that my son has had this whole cancer thing. We're like very confident at this point that he's cured and all better. And that's not really a worry. But there's always this kind of back of the mind thing that, what if we do get some bad news or whatever, and I have to fly home right away? So I bought a one-way ticket just from Detroit to Beijing through Washington, D.C. And I entered the country with no return ticket. And I figured that out actually on the fly while I was there. So that's an option, at least if you have the business visa. And I was surprised that was an option, because certainly some places that I have been, if you don't have the return ticket, they'll give you a hard time for that. So now going back to the technology. So, okay, you're going to set up an entirely new technology profile to go to China. What do you do? What I decided to do was buy an Android phone. I normally use an iPhone, but I decided I'll do something a little bit different and buy an Android phone just to experience an Android phone for the first time in a long time. That may or may not have been the best idea, because I do think Apple in general works a bit better in China. Like Apple Maps, for example, people say works very well. Google Maps, not as well. There are local mapping alternatives as well that you can download and use. But you might have a little bit better experience overall with just all the little details with an iPhone, because Apple is active in China. People in China do have iPhones. They do not have Google Pixels, really, and that's what I was using. But it ended up still being totally fine, because the biggest thing that I think is a major point of confusion is that you're not going to be able to access. If you bring your international connection, you're not going to be able to access all the stuff back home because of the Great Firewall. And really, in today's world, if you have a cell connection, that's not really an issue at all. It seems that the Great Firewall is basically, I think by design, just really not an issue for foreigners who come in with a cell connection. And I'm not an expert in exactly how all this technology works under the hood, but my understanding is that when you go in with an international roaming plan, you are connected, of course, to the local cell tower with your phone, but that your traffic requests actually route back to your home carrier first. Then they get processed out to whatever websites or services you're trying to use, and then they get routed back from your home carrier to the Chinese local carrier, and finally to your phone. And so you're bypassing all of these content filters just based on the fact that you're there with an international roaming plan. I wasn't 100% confident that was going to work, but increasingly I got more confident as I did more research, and my experience in the end was that worked totally smoothly. I decided to have two phone numbers for a couple different reasons. One was that I was trying to do this whole alter ego for the Chinese internet. And so I figured I should have a new email address. I created a new Gmail, which is my main Gmail with a .travel on the end of it. I signed up for 1 month of Google Fi wireless, which comes with a good international roaming plan, which was said to work in China. And that came with a new phone number as well. And then I also, at the last minute, decided it's not such a big deal if they know my main American phone number. That doesn't really give them any, ability to put spyware on my device or anything. So I also moved my main phone number over to the burner phone, which is just a pretty simple eSIM transfer. It's been a while since I've done that sort of thing, but it worked very smoothly, even across Apple to Android. The process of transferring an eSIM from one to the other was really pretty easy. So with that transfer, I had dual SIMs on the one phone, which meant I had two phone numbers. I could receive text messages. I could receive phone calls of both of them. I could make phone calls and send text messages out with both of those phone numbers. And I had the two roaming plans from each of the carriers as well. The one carrier I used was Google Fi, which I just got for this month, and then I normally have T-Mobile. And I signed up for the month-long international roaming plan for whatever extra charge that was. And between those two things, I have the two roaming plans, both of which have this property of you connect to the local cellular internet, but your traffic is routed immediately out of the country through your home carrier to whatever services you're trying to access, and then back through that chain to you. And this basically meant that in practice, there was, for me, no Great Firewall to worry about. I did also get a VPN as a backup, and that comes with its own eSIM, and those are supposed to be like China smart. I never really had to use that, to be honest. The two main carriers just worked very smoothly, and it was not a big deal at all. I did sign up for all the Chinese services with this alternate Gmail, which I created just for the trip. And it is really important that you get the Chinese services. People tell you have to do it all beforehand because the Google Play Store won't be available when you get there. And this is, again, where the Apple experience might be a bit better because the App Store is available because Apple is active in China. But the Google Play Store is blocked in China to most Chinese users on local services. But when you're using the international roaming plan, even the Google Play Store was available for me throughout. And I did download some additional apps while I was there, and I had no problem doing that. Nevertheless, I do think it's smart to set up your technology as thoroughly as possible before you go, so you're not fumbling around with it when you get there. And there are a few apps that you definitely will want to have that you'll really, frankly, just pretty much have to have a good time of it in China. The ones that everybody knows about are probably WeChat and Alipay. WeChat is the super app that kind of does everything in China. It's like your sort of social network, address book, content. There's a whole bunch of content and a business and ability to transact with businesses, book businesses. I barely even got into that compared to the vast universe that it is. And it also handles payments. So that's WeChat. And then there's Alipay, which is another, major payment network in China, which again has tons more features and is a super app of its own that I didn't really use. Although that's not used so much for connecting with people and communicating with people. WeChat is the thing that people use just nonstop, where you have your own QR code, they have a QR code, and there's sort of the question of when you're connecting with someone, like, am I going to scan you or are you going to scan me? But either way, there's this quick scan process. The apps recognize the QR codes so fast. You don't have to tap on them or whatever. You just go into scan mode and you don't even have the whole QR code in frame for it to recognize the QR code. That stuff works super well. So you need the WeChat to be able to connect with people and also make payments. You need the Alipay as kind of a secondary payment system. Those both now do support international credit cards. So you can load up a couple credit cards into each one. And with that done, you're pretty much good to go for making the vast majority of connections and purchases that you might want to make in China. The other app that you'll want to have for sure is DiDi, which is their equivalent of Uber. And it works basically the same way. There's some kind of small but interesting differences where when you're quoted a fare, for example, at the beginning of a ride, if it's a small enough fare, you don't actually pay in advance. You instead get a sort of rough quote, you agree to that, and then you actually get the final number at the end and you pay after the fact. So you actually don't pay until after the ride. So many times I was going to get my next ride and then it was like, okay, you got to pay for the last ride first. Interesting, small difference, didn't really make a big practical difference in my overall experience. In the big cities, and I was only in Beijing and Shanghai where I actually called DiDis for rides, it's a very similar experience to Uber in a big city. It's a very liquid market, fast pickup, at this point, like a bunch of different levels of car that you can get, from the most basic economy to priority faster pickup to premium cars to luxury cars to XL. So that experience is very familiar to anyone who's used Uber. And the biggest difference, honestly, is that it's really just cheap. Like the number of cross-town 30, 40-minute rides that I took that came in the $6 to $8 range is really pretty remarkable. It would easily be, in many cases, close to 10 times that much, if not fully 10 times that much for some of these rides in the United States. But that was simple to do and worked easily. One thing I can say is it was actually hard for me to confirm that my credit cards were going to work. I loaded them up into the apps and they were accepted into the apps as payment methods. But then there's all these different ways that Chinese people use to move money around in the app that are not accessible to international cards. So I made a few connections on WeChat via just people that I knew in China. They introduced me to a couple of friends, and I got connected to them. on WeChat even before leaving. And when you go in there, the menu includes things like send money to this person. And so you try to do that. I was just trying to do it just to make sure that my credit card would not block a payment just because it was on this unfamiliar Chinese app. And all those features pretty much are not accessible to international users for whatever reason. I'm honestly not sure why. And I'm pretty sure that's a WeChat or maybe a Chinese government decision. It was not something that my credit card was blocking. It's just you get to the final step in the app and it's, oh, your payment method is not supported to make this kind of transfer. So I actually wasn't able to do any transactions in WeChat before getting on the ground there. So my very first order of business when I landed in Beijing at 3 a.m. was I need to go to some little kiosk or whatever at the airport and make sure that I can make a payment before I leave the airport because I want to make absolutely sure that I was able to transact. China is pretty much a cashless society at this point. I did not see any cash at all while I was there the entire time. And I actually wanted to bring a few bills home for my kids just as souvenirs. There was never an opportunity when it was like, oh, you have cash. Can I somehow get some cash from you? The one time when I actually did do it was when I met a friend of a friend for a meal. And I mentioned, is there anywhere I can get cash? And one of the guys that I was having lunch with said, I think I have some at my desk. Let me go back to my office for a second. I'll see if I can get some at the desk. He was like, we really don't use it, which I knew at that point. But he said, I'll go see if I can get some. And sure enough, he did have some. And I was able to exchange a few American dollars in cash for some Chinese cash. Other than that, I did not touch cash, and I would have easily not touched or thought about cash the entire time. Online, what I was finding was that people were saying a lot of people don't even take cash. What I was told on the ground there is that the law is that businesses have to take cash. So if you were to bring cash and change money at the airport, I guess that might work, but it would definitely put you in a very different user experience, let's say, than what people around you are doing. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some places where they either don't want to take it, or if it's an automated thing, or it's just not set up to take it at all. If you're buying tickets or whatever in various places, I would imagine that there could be some things that could be quite tough to do with cash these days because it really is super cashless, which is super convenient and also definitely enables a lot of visibility into what kind of transactions are happening in the economy. But yeah, made me a little nervous showing up, not knowing if my credit cards were actually going to be supported. But sure enough, when I did land, went to the first kiosk I saw, picked up a fruit drink that looked pretty interesting. I think that drink was under $2 at the airport for a kind of fresh juice that would have been easily $6, $7, $8 at a US airport. And then I was fumbling around with my first transaction trying to figure out, because it was a self-checkout. There was no person there to help. How do I actually do this transaction? So I scanned my product and it pulled up the price. And then I'm like, okay, what do I do now? And eventually I figured out how to show my payment QR code to the camera in the machine. And it's actually by showing my QR code to that machine that it registers, okay, this person is paying for this. And then as soon as you do that, you get the beep, and then you look at your phone and it says processing payment. And a couple seconds later, it's boom, payment is processed and you're gone. That's quite interesting and quite different from, of course, how China used to be. A lot of people, I think, have either experienced themselves in the past if they went years ago, or have heard that there's a lot of pushy sales going on in China, or that there's a lot of haggling, or that there's a lot of ripoffs. And honestly, I would say none of that was an issue at all. In today's world, the economy is really very formal in the sense of it's all pretty much by the book. Everything has a price. People really didn't hassle you much at all. I had just a couple of very minor moments where anybody tried to talk me into buying something. And I did go to some tourist places, so it's not like I did go to I went to the Great Wall, so I went to some places where there were definitely the kind of souvenir shop places where in many parts of the world, you would be like aggressively approached and tried to talk into buying things. It really wasn't like that. It was very low key, low pressure. And when you did go to buy things, they had prices. You really weren't expected to negotiate or haggle at all. There really wasn't much opportunity for that. And there also really wasn't, in my experience, any ripoff. It was all just, here's the price, boom, here's the thing, here's the place to scan, here's the payment code, and boom, you're kind of done. So in that respect, it was all extremely modern. I would say, honestly, in a number of ways, China feels like maybe the most modern place that I have ever been. One other app that you would definitely want to get is the .com app. This is kind of the national tourist platform for China, and it works in other places too. But it's the way to book things in China, whether that's hotels or attractions, plane tickets, train tickets. It's all kind of there, and it's all pretty centralized. This is a theme in China in general. You're going to use these very standard platforms that everybody uses, everybody's on, and work, in my experience, really well. So trip.com is another thing to download before you go. I booked a high-speed rail ticket on it. I booked a plane ticket on it at one point. I booked the ticket to the Great Wall on it, booked a bunch of different hotel rooms on it, and all super smooth. Again, your payment methods are loaded in there before you go, and then when it's time to book things, it's just a couple clicks. And then when you show up to places, you've got your tickets right in the app, and you just open up your app. And again, it's usually a QR code, and you kind of just be, boom, here's my QR code, and you're admitted to things. So the level of integration and the sort of ubiquity of these platforms is really hard to overstate. Obviously, in the US, we have very similar options where people can pay each other via apps. We've got your Venmos and your Cash Apps. But then they're a young person's game. They're not the kind of thing you can just expect that everybody is going to take. In China, it really is everybody is on the apps. Every person of every age is on WeChat. There was not one person who was not on WeChat that I encountered. And I don't know what percentage of the population is on WeChat at this point, but it has got to be super, super high. Similarly with the payments, of course, they're all on that. They're all on Alipay. All the businesses, everything you might be interested in from a tourist standpoint are on these platforms, and you really can manage all your business through the phone. Meituan is another one that I think is probably worth downloading. Their delivery app. It's sort of an Amazon like everything store experience, but with more of an emphasis on food delivery and just really quick delivery of all kinds of things. And it's cool, and definitely a high quality user experience. All the other apps that I've mentioned, WeChat has an English language interface that you can use. You just need to switch the language to English. Alipay doesn't have a full-on English version that I found, but it does have a translate button that kind of hovers around. I guess I'm sure that's not there for everybody all the time, but it somehow identified me as maybe needing the translate option. And so there's this translate button that you can just press anytime to see a translation of whatever it is you're looking at in the app. DiDi has an English version. Trip.com has an English version. So all these things are very easy to use. Meituan does not, as far as I know, have a fully English version. And so that one can be a little bit overwhelming to use. I had a great experience using Google Lens. And this is actually one of the things that probably is a little bit nicer about the Android phone is that you take these screenshots and then immediately you've got the Google Translate options to translate whatever text is in the image that you just took a screenshot of. So at times I was definitely taking a lot of screenshots of interfaces to see what it was that I was looking at. Even just to order in a restaurant, a lot of times you would kind of do it through Meituan or another app where they put QR codes on the table. To pull up the menu, you scan the QR code. To order, you do it in the app from the table, and then you pay again through one of the major payment platforms. All that happens on your app. You're not even talking to a server at any point in some of these restaurants. And then a little bit later, your food comes, and that's it. Your entire transaction was mediated on the phone. And in some cases, that involved a lot of screenshots and translations. So definitely recommend the Google Translate app. The Microsoft Translate app is also well used. And then everybody in China has the Translate app on their phone as well. Every DiDi driver, every service provider of any kind, certainly everybody at a hotel concierge, and usually at hotel concierge, you'll get decent English, although not always in my experience. But they always have the Translate app there, and they're just
super quick to record themselves speaking in Chinese and then show you what they just said, and you can go back and forth that way. And that works really quite well these days. It's strikingly easy to travel through a place like China and not really feel like you're lost. That between the Maps apps and the super apps and the translation apps, I would say it's still an adventure, but to imagine what it would have been like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to go there and just be totally immersed in a very different place and constantly needing to ask people around you for help and trying to negotiate these situations in broken language back and forth. Basically, all of that is history now. It's really quite smooth. Just don't lose your phone and you'll be fine. And even then, I'll talk a little bit about losing phones and how easy it is to get them back and how well a lot of their systems really work. So that was my whole parallel universe setup, right? I've got this different phone, new Gmail account, a new Signal account, a new WhatsApp account with that new email and that new phone number, the WeChat account, the Alipay account, load up the credit cards into those, get the DiDi account for rides, get the trip.com account, load up a couple of cards into that so I can book anything that I need to book. And with all that stuff, and with especially having two international or two US, what are international phone numbers there, with the international roaming plans on, the tech experience was really incredibly smooth and highly enabling throughout the entire trip. What I did for contact with home base, because I do have a pretty good agent set up at home, is I left my main computer on, I left my Mac Mini on, and I instructed Claude to monitor my communications, which it has access to already. It has access to my Gmail. I've done previous episodes about this, so if you haven't heard those, you could maybe go back to the Daniel Miessler episode to get a more thorough walkthrough of my particular agent setup, which is working quite well for me. Because of this pretty extensive setup that already happened, I was able to just tell Claude with a couple prompts, I'm going to be gone for the next couple of weeks. Here's what I want you to do. Monitor my communications. Send me a digest a couple times a day. Let me know if there's anything urgent, anything that needs my attention in general. And then I will be able to respond back to you from my travel email. I also set up an Outlook as well, because again, while Gmail in theory is blocked in China, Outlook is not. You can use Microsoft products and Outlook is available even if you're behind the Great Firewall. For me, this was not an issue at all. I never had to use the Outlook. I just used the Gmail and I had perfect access to it all the time because I was just using my roaming plan, but I did have that as a fallback. So I told Claude I might respond to the digests and I might also send in email. I might send an email to my own home address, and I want you to respond to those emails and do whatever it is that I ask you to do. It initially said, okay, we're going to need some sort of, Claude can get really into the security mindset. And I did have a fairly extensive back and forth with it about how much of this stuff do I really need to do and exactly how should I go about it. At one point, it had a password set up where when I emailed in, I was supposed to give it a password. And I said, I don't think I want to be giving you a password every time. First of all, that if anybody is hacking my stuff, if they are reading my emails somehow on this burner phone, they're going to see the password. So that didn't make a lot of sense to me. I said, why don't you just apply a sensible filter? If the requests seem reasonable, if they seem like they're coming from me, if they seem like they're low risk, just run a check on all the inbounds that you get from me. And if it passes those checks, you can just do it. And if it doesn't, then you can issue me a challenge and do a sort of ask me some trivia that only I would know the answer to or whatever based on all the work that we've done together. And it agreed to do that. And of course, that never came up. But I had a pretty good time of it where I was able to get these digests. I had Claude responding from my main account, because one thing that I wanted to make sure is that if I got an email and I wanted to respond to somebody, I didn't want to have the response coming from a different address because it might get filtered out of their priority inbox or whatever, or they would just confuse them. So instead, I had Claude respond as me, which I normally never do. But when I say as me, respond from my address. But I just instructed it to introduce itself as Claude, which was funny at times. It was like, hi, I'm Claude, an AI assistant. I was like, okay, at one point I gave feedback. Because people know who you are, Claude. You don't need to tell everybody that you're an AI assistant. At least in the circles that I run in,
that's known. But it would explain Nathan's traveling in China. I'm monitoring the comms. I'm copying his travel email here. He can respond. There were a couple times where somebody sent me something where I was like, leave it up to them. You respond to them, tell them what's up. If they want to add me on this, knowing that I'm in China, and take whatever risk is associated with that, which I think is pretty minimal, but we can let them decide. There were a couple times when we did that. But most of the time, Claude is just monitoring, giving me these digests. There wasn't too much that was urgent that I needed to do. But when there was, I could respond to Claude and say, okay, in this case, it's fine. Loop me in or even just take care of something. And Claude did a pretty good job. I think there were a couple little rough parts, but we gradually ironed those out. And I think at this point, if I were to go back, it would be really easy to just re-enable Claude and have it monitoring my communications. And really the only thing that I had to even have anybody help with was a couple times, I think it happened twice, my Gmail authentication expired. And so then I had to have it refresh. And it didn't seem to want to refresh its own token through the browser. So I'm going to need to give it some instructions to be like, do it when you need to do it, because it can use the browser, of course. But it was kind of getting a little stuck on that. So when I spoke to my wife, I said, hey, could you do a quick re-auth of just go to my computer, it's on my desk, and tell Claude, hey, she would just open up a new Claude session locally in the terminal. I still use the terminal as opposed to the co-work. Type Claude, tell it we need to re-auth Gmail. It would pop open the window. She would click the clicks, and we're back in business. And that takes 2 minutes. So that's my tech setup. I think for folks in the AI space, it's easy enough to do that I guess it's probably recommended. It's definitely recommended by people who know more than me about information security. So I guess I would just say it's not that much trouble. Know that the firewall is not really going to be an issue. I think having 2 lines and a VPN backup is probably just prudent. But with a cheap burner phone and an extra line and the VPN backup, you are in, I think, a very good place from an information security standpoint, and you can have your agents run your life from home. And for me, this worked really well. I am telling my parents, who do some international traveling now that my dad is retired, that they should go to China. And what I would suggest for them is much, much simpler. I don't think they need to. They're not in the AI game at all. So I told them, maybe you could just get a second number if you wanted to have redundancy, or the 2 of you, both with your own numbers. That is 2 numbers. It should be pretty good. Just download WeChat, download Alipay, get Trip.com, get DiDi, and you're good. Your internet will work. Make sure your international roaming is enabled. Make sure you have enough data to support the time that you'll be there, and you're good to go. I don't think the average person really needs to do any extreme precautions. But for those in the AI game, the setup that I went through is simple enough, and you can have it done, honestly, in just a couple hours. It took me longer to figure all this stuff out because I found, again, that the searching and the AI's answers were a lot of FUD, a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what's going to work. Are you going to be behind the firewall? VPNs go in and out of business, and they're illegal, and it's okay, wow. But in the end, that setup was all pretty simple. So I would say you can do that, and you should be pretty confident that it's going to work pretty well. A couple other little details there. You don't even need a power adapter in China. The outlets that they use, at least in all of the hotels and major places that I went, were universal outlets that would accept, I think, any major, and of course I didn't try every major type of plug, but certainly the US standard 2 and 3 prong plug, they were perfectly well set up for, as well as a number of other types. And so I didn't even have to take an adapter. It was super, super, super simple to just bring my normal device with normal charger. Very easy. I think it is also worth talking a little bit about just the level of tech integration, just to drive home like how much they really have tied everything together. And this is for good in the sense of a incredible user experience. It, in some ways, might be for bad to the degree that you're concerned about surveillance. And I think the surveillance definitely has real upside, but also real downside potential for the Chinese public. But to just illustrate like how thorough the integration process has been, when you call a ride on DiDi. As in Uber, it'll say, okay, we've matched you to a car, and here's your driver, and here's their license plate, whatever, and the type of car that they're going to be driving. Okay, then you can see them approaching on their route in the same way that you can with Uber, as you're all familiar with. But when the car that you're waiting for is stopped at a red light, you can literally see the red light countdown clock in your app. So that red light that has a timer on it is connected to some centralized system that DiDi can in turn call. And you're literally able to watch the countdown until when that red light is going to turn green and your car can again start making progress toward you. I thought that was really quite impressive, and it's indicative of the level of integration that they have across so many information systems. Another one that was pretty interesting was in one hotel, as soon as I would put the key into the thing for the lights to turn on, right? Some hotels have this where you have to put your key into a little slot in order to enable the rest of the room to work. As soon as I did that in this one hotel, the TV turned on and started kind of yapping at me, which I thought was a little bit weird and annoying. But then that gave me occasion to notice that the TV was showing me the status of the laundry room in the hotel. In this particular hotel, they didn't offer a laundry service, but they did just have a room downstairs where there were a few washers and dryers that were just free to use for hotel guests. And then, of course, this raises the question, is it available now? And I wouldn't even think in the rest of the world of any other way to answer that question other than going to the room and checking it out. But here, they had wired it up such that the status of the laundry room washers and dryers was on the screen of the TV when it turned on in the room. So again, this just gives a flavor of how thorough the tech integration has been. The Meituan delivery experience is also another indication of the user experience that you can expect. I had a weird experience one night in the middle of the night where I woke up with basically an allergic reaction ongoing. And I never have allergic reactions, so this was quite strange to me. But the next morning, I told my friends about it, and we were going on a bus from one place to another. And they said, would it be helpful to have some like Claritin or whatever? And I said, yeah, I guess it probably would. Hopefully it won't happen again, but if it does, like I would probably benefit from that, yes. Sure enough, when we get to the destination, it was only like 20 minutes later. There was Claritin waiting for us at the destination. The woman I was talking to had just gone on the Meituan app, requested this particular medicine, which is available over the counter, gave the address that we were going to, and boom, it's delivered there, beat us to the place. So that's how fast some of these deliveries can show up. You can order ahead and have your allergy medications arrive at your destination with even just 20-minute lead time, and they can beat you there. So it was really very impressive in all those little touch point user experience sort of ways. Again, I did feel like it was the most modern feeling place that I had ever been from a technology perspective. And another kind of interesting thought experiment that I've been running is if you were to go to New York or San Francisco or both, and then separately you were to go to Beijing and Shanghai or both, and you didn't know anything about the countries or the history, and probably would also have to mask the prices because the price differential is definitely significant, and just spend a week in each of these places, and then ask, which of these countries is the richer country? I think it would be pretty clear to most people. I think you would get, honestly, an overwhelming majority of people saying that China is the richer country because it does have newer stuff and more integrated, lower friction experience that just feels like the future. And it's ubiquitous across at least the major cities that I've been to. But from what I understand, it really has extended across China to a really remarkable extent. So we'll probably come back to that maybe a little bit later today, and definitely a little bit more in the next 2 episodes that I plan to do about this. But kind of a bottom line, what does it feel to be there? Litmus test, I think it does feel more modern and in some ways more developed than life in the United States does, which is a pretty remarkable
accomplishment, obviously, for Chinese government, Chinese society as a whole. Okay, so in Beijing, I did a couple days worth of tourism when I first got there before the real AI-focused part of the trip opened up. And again, a couple just high-level comments, and I'm not going to turn this into a travel blog, but Beijing is absolutely a world-class city from a tourist perspective. If you're going there for no reason other than to see some history and see some famous sites, it is absolutely a world-class destination. The number of incredible sites is enough to keep you busy for, I would say, easily a full week. And I would put it on the level of Paris in terms of just everywhere you go, you're looking at incredible, deep history with beautiful architecture, really remarkable sites all over the place. And mostly I did these on my own. Mostly I did them just either catching a DiDi to the place and or walking to the place, and then with no tour guide. I did hire a tour guide one time, and I'll tell a little bit more about that. But mostly I was just using AIs as the tour guide. I decided to leave because I had this whole alter ego strategy, I left my main Claude and ChatGPT accounts at home. And I figured I'll just use Chinese AIs for this trip. So you don't necessarily need to do that, especially because you, again, the Great Firewall is not such an issue if you're using an international roaming plan. But I figured it's a good opportunity to get a little bit more familiar with Chinese AIs. So I downloaded DeepSeek, the Kimi app, and MiniMax all to my phone before leaving. And those were the three AIs that I mostly used as I was going about my couple days of tourism. So I used them as both kind of travel planner, like here I am. Actually, I was planning to go to the Great Wall, the very first thing, directly from the airport. But it had been raining heavily, and so they actually closed a couple sites at the Great Wall, and I wasn't able to go. I had even booked a ticket, but again, Trip.com, the integration is quite good. So I got a notification from Trip.com saying, hey, you can't go to this thing today because it's closed. Your ticket's been refunded. This is due to heavy rain, whatever. It'll be open again tomorrow. So I was like, okay, my plan is immediately thrown a little bit into flux. I'll go to the AIs and say, hey, here's where I am in Beijing, and here's what time it is, and what day of the week it is, and what should I do? And they were really quite helpful. I think this stuff, these experiences do illustrate that you don't necessarily need frontier intelligence for many quite valuable use cases. I was using Kimi 2.6 to serve as my tour guide for all these different places, as well as, actually, there were, of course, not of course, but if you're watching Chinese AI, you would know that there are a couple of notable model releases just in the last couple weeks while I was there. Not a coincidence, because I went in part for the WAIC event, and this was a big moment in Chinese AI, and President Xi headlined the event by opening with a keynote. So naturally, a couple of model companies wanted to time their release to this event. So we got Kimi K3 right around the time of the event. But my little tourism was a little bit before that. So I was using Kimi 2.6. And these were very good experiences that I found to be very useful and informative as tour guides. And the fact that there might not be frontier models capable of doing long horizon agentic tasks and capable of various cyber exploits or what have you really wasn't relevant. They were perfectly good and really quite fast in their response in many cases, perfectly good to educate me about what I was seeing. So just going through all these different places, from the Lama Temple, which is a Tibetan Buddhist temple right in the heart of Beijing, which was a surprise to me. I was like, oh, wow, we have wait, what? This is a Tibetan Buddhist temple? I didn't expect to see that here. It had pretty good historical explanations for how this came to be. And I was asking, this does go to show my ignorance of China. I wasn't under the impression that there was no religion in China. I've seen enough stuff on TikTok to know that there is religion in China and people do practice religion. My sense is broadly, as long as it's not challenging the state, you're permitted to participate in most religion as you wish. And yeah, here we even had a Tibetan Buddhist temple right in the heart of Beijing. So I was getting the history on that. Then I went over to
the Temple of Confucius and the Imperial College. And again, I had a lot of questions like, wait a second, Confucius, he's not seen as a god, right? He was just a philosopher, wasn't he? Like, why does he have a temple? And it does show some fundamental paradigmatic differences between Eastern and Western society, where it's like, yes, he is a man. He's not considered to be a god, but he also is revered and he's not worshipped, but he is the object of these ritual behaviors or ritual traditions that was not just something that some people did some of the time, but was even understood to be part of the obligations of the emperor. The emperor was meant to be sort of related to God, like the son of God might be a little too Christian framing, but definitely some sort of like divine connection. But the emperor also had duties, and it was the emperor's job to do the right rituals in the right way. And those over time came to involve giving offerings and whatnot at the Temple of Confucius. And so it's like it's kind of a colors outside the lines as we know them in terms of what is religion and what is state. Does this blur the separation of church and state? But also it's not exactly religion in the same way. Kind of unfamiliar stuff, but really helpful explanations from the Chinese AI. I thought they were perfectly good. And by the way, I didn't even pay for them. This was all free usage across all three of these apps. And I had a pretty good time of it. There were some issues with refusals. And at times I thought probably even by the standards of like what they wanted over refusals. So I would say like Anthropic is not the only company that currently has an over refusal issue. I was asking some, I wouldn't even say sensitive questions, right? But when you get to issues of the question of Tibet, you're going to get, and Taiwan, right? That you're going to get some, they call it the 3 Ts, Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen. Those are obviously sensitive issues in the Chinese context. So I wasn't asking questions just to like probe at what will the AI systems answer or not answer. I was really asking pretty earnest questions about what's the deal with a Tibetan Buddhist temple here in Beijing. That obviously touched on issues of Tibet in a kind of tangential way. I wasn't asking about the status of Tibet today, more history kind of questions. There was another question that because I don't know a lot about Chinese history, so I'm like, okay, who built this? And what's the deal? Well, you've got the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty. What's the deal with those? The latter is, interestingly, a minority dynasty that came in and took over. So the Qing dynasty was actually the Manchu ethnic group that was just northeast of kind of Chinese heartland. And they managed to come in and take over the empire, conquer the place, and then rule it for hundreds of years, which is an interesting and obviously pretty impressive accomplishment. And this Manchu ethnic group, they have their own language. So you see this reflected in some of these artifacts where there would be multiple different languages. You would see the Mandarin Chinese, you would see the Manchu language, you would see sometimes the Tibetan language, I think sometimes also maybe a Western Chinese language, but there were often like 4 languages that were used and equally represented in these like monuments or sort of proclamations that were going out to the empire. And so at one time I asked, what's up with the Man group today? Are they still around? Are they still part of China? And there you would get the kind of classic old Sidney Bing experience where the model itself would answer the question and you'd see kind of the chain of thought. You might even see the beginning of an answer. And then sometimes, like with this Manchu question, because again, you're touching on something fairly sensitive in the Chinese political context of ethnic minorities, the answer is in the process of unrolling in front of you. And then you would get this pullback. You'd see the answer disappear. And then you'd see, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. Ask a different question or whatever. And again, this wasn't something that I think they really even necessarily meant to censor. And not all of the apps censored it the same way. I was able to get some answers from some apps that I wasn't able to get from other apps. It goes to show that in many ways, the Chinese ecosystem has a lot of the same things going on that we do, where people are trying to make sure that they're on the right side of regulators, on the right side of history, acting responsibly as they understand it. And at times that can go a little too far and it can interfere with the user experience. But this is also consistent with the reporting that I've seen in many places that the Chinese models themselves are not very censored. It's the actual deployed application experiences that usually contain the censorship. And you could see that as the answer was like partially there, and then it would be retracted sometimes and you'd be hit with this, no, I'm sorry, I can't help you. So it was overall, I'd say, a very good experience with the Chinese AIs. And of course, I'm doing this all in English. They do have, some of them have weird quirks where I think it's in DeepSeek advanced mode with the best DeepSeek model. Yeah, if you go into expert mode on DeepSeek, then you can't attach any files and there's also no search enabled. That's kind of weird. I'm not sure why that's the case, but that is the case. Either use, depending on what I was trying to do, I might just use the instant mode on DeepSeek. On Kimi, that issue is not there. You had the ability to have the model do searches even with the best model that was available at the time. And MiniMax, I think, was probably the most consistent and reliable, just a very down the fairway experience. But I think I had probably the least over refusals from the MiniMax app. So I did find occasion to use all three. I'd say for my taste, Kimi is the best of those apps, but there were times when I got better, if only for the over refusal issue, there were times when I got better answers from other apps. You might say Kimi is the most Claude-like, and that obviously brings to mind issues of distillation. I think I'll probably talk about that a little bit more in future episodes than this one. But Kimi, I would say, had the best kind of vibes, the best taste, and that may be partially related to accusations of distillation from Claude, but I think it does run a bit deeper than that too. From what I know of the company Moonshot, like they have a real aesthetic, and their name itself was inspired by the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album. They've got graphics that echo the prism art from the album, the famous album cover from Pink Floyd, and they're definitely an organization that takes the aesthetics of the AI that they're building very seriously. So I think there's a lot there that is more than just distillation from Claude, although I do think the case is fairly compelling that at least some distillation is going on. We'll get into that probably more in a future deeper dive into some of these US-China issues. I guess one other note about how much do I trust the Chinese AIs is that when I did have that allergic reaction in the middle of the night, which was a fortunately very short-lived but very strange experience. I just woke up and my hands were itching like crazy, and I was like, what is going on? My hands are so itchy. And then I got up and turned on a light and looked at myself in the mirror, and my kind of whole upper body torso was like covered in hives. It's like, yikes, that's pretty weird. What did I do in that moment? I downloaded ChatGPT because I did have the sense that, okay, for these tour guide things, I'm getting great answers. It's educating me. I'm pleased. I'm like happy with this experience. But now we're in a health possible emergency. I didn't really know what was going on. I wanted my ChatGPT. I knew I've had Karan from OpenAI, who leads health at OpenAI, on the podcast. And I've been, like I say, deep experience using it with my son's case. And I just felt like in this moment, I'm going for the best, right? And it of course helps that they've made their best health experiences available to even free users. So I was just able to go in and ask my questions, and I was very confident that I was getting the best experience that I could get. I did not even create an account. I did not pay for a new account. I did not log into my home account, but I wanted ChatGPT in that moment. And fortunately, this allergic reaction that I experienced just kind of passed. Even over the course of chatting with the AI for 15 minutes or so, a couple rounds, and just observing myself, I could tell that it was passing. So it went from, this is probably not an emergency, but you should probably go get checked out now, to, okay, if it's passing and you're feeling like the symptoms are already reducing, then you can probably just go back to sleep and sleep it off. And anyway, that's what I ended up doing. But I did think it was notable from an AI perspective that in that moment, where I was like a little bit alarmed, I still wanted to go back to ChatGPT just for the confidence that this is probably going to be the best answer that I can get, and was worth the extra effort to download the app to do that. Okay, let's see. What else do I want to talk about today? I think I'll just do some observations of Chinese society. I'm not going to, again, turn this into a travel log, but I do think it's worth noting that people are just incredibly nice. The hospitality that I experienced at every turn was outstanding. I don't mean to contrast this with the West. I think one of the more heartwarming trends of the summer was seeing people from all over the world come to the United States and travel around and go to some of the cities that hosted games that they probably wouldn't otherwise have ever gone to. And some people even just doing road trips from city to city. And people had a really great time and had really great things to say about the United States. So I think that our people are also very warm and hospitable, and the track record from this summer and the reports from World Cup travelers really supports that. So again, this is not meant to be a contrast, but my experience in China was outstanding. People were extremely friendly. I had really, I would say, 0 negative interactions. There was almost nothing that I would call problematic at all. As I mentioned earlier, very few even pushy sales interactions. I can remember a couple short moments where somebody tried to get me to ride his bike taxi with him, and I really didn't want to, and he kind of followed me for a couple minutes trying to get me to do it. I was like, dude, I'm okay. I'm happy walking. And he got the message and went on his way. In many parts of the world, you would have probably a lot more of that than you did in China. So it was like definitely impressive and very smooth sailing in that regard. Service also is just like generally really good. And it's not a tipping culture. Like at no point are you invited to tip. The price is the price, and it is a flat price. When you do a WeChat checkout or even a DiDi checkout, there's no moment in that flow where you're like, hey, would you like to add 10%? Would you like to do this or that? It's just not there. So they are not expecting tips, and yet they are consistently delivering high quality service. Service at the hotels I found to be like really very helpful. I wasn't necessarily interacting with like concierge. A couple of the places I stayed at, one place definitely did have a concierge and was super helpful. In fact, one pro tip that I would give there is that the DiDi app, as it is served up in the English version to foreigners, doesn't have quite all the same features that the native one has for people that are with Chinese identification and bank cards and what have you. And I'm not sure why, but it doesn't. So one of the features that the Chinese version of the app does have, but that my version of the app didn't have, is the ability to hire a car by the hour. And so for one of my like power tourist days, that was definitely the best option. I was at the Summer Palace, which is a beautiful, beautiful site created by the Qing dynasty that was destroyed by Europeans at one point and then rebuilt. But it's a very cool and beautiful place to be. I then wanted to go to the Forbidden City in the afternoon and then to the Great Wall in the evening. And I tried to do that all in one day. And to do that, I was like, I really need a driver who can take me to all these places. But how can I hire one? The concierge at this one hotel said, if you do it by the hour, it should be fine. I said, I don't have the ability to do that. They looked at my app and they're like, oh yeah, no, you don't. That's weird. We can do it for you. Okay, great. How is that going to work? We'll just do it on our DiDi app here. We'll pay for it. You'll pay us. And then I'll also set up a WeChat between you, me, and the driver, because the driver probably won't speak much English. But then if anything you need, if you need any translation help or whatever, you can send a message into the group. And we'll just monitor this throughout the day and help you out as you need it, and it'll be great. And sure enough, that was extremely helpful in multiple ways. The fact that just renting the car in this way and having the driver who could take me to these places, and it was not expensive. I think the whole day's rental it was over 8 hours, and it was probably 9 hours from start to finish that the guy took me around, waited for me the whole time outside of the places that I went to. I think that all together came out to something like $120, $125. Really very, very affordable given what I was getting. And yeah, the hotel paid, I paid them, and they stayed active in the chat throughout the day, just making sure that I was able to effectively coordinate with my driver. And that was after I checked out of the hotel, by the way. That was on the day that I left the hotel. So I wasn't even coming back. And they were still extremely helpful in doing that for hours to come. That similar things happened at a couple other hotels too. When I wanted to, for one night, for example, it was raining pretty hard, and I was asking, "Oh, is there a place I can go out for food that's close?" And like, I had this one dish that I wanted to get that was a crab noodle dish, and that might have been the thing, by the way, that gave me the allergic reaction because it was later that night that happened. But the guy at the hotel desk said, "You could go here, but you can also order delivery." And I was like, "Yeah, but I don't really know how to do that." And he said, "I'll do it for you, no problem." So he just, again, pulled up his phone, did it on his personal Meituan app, and showed me what he was ordering me, showed me the price, said, "Is that cool with you?" Yep. Then he was able to send me a little on-the-fly invoice from WeChat or Alipay. I was able to pay him. He got the money inbound for me, and then he, boom, hits the checkout on the thing, and next thing I've got delivery coming. It was super easy. Part of the reason that's possible, by the way, is that the transaction costs on payments in China are super, super low. They are like basically an order of magnitude lower than the transaction costs that we have in the United States, where it's like 2 to 3% of the credit card transaction goes to credit card fees, to the point now that we have in gas stations in the US, and a bunch of businesses will be like, either have a minimum, or it's an extra dollar if you want to use a credit card, or it's an extra few percent if you want to use a credit card, or it's 10 cents more per gallon of gas or whatever. We've started to see this sort of businesses not wanting to accept that cost on their side anymore and putting it back on the consumer. In the Chinese context, the transaction costs, from what I understand, are more like 0.25% of transactions. And I'm not really sure how they're pulling that off. I did ask some AIs, and one answer is they don't have rewards in the same way that we do. All your credit card rewards, all that kind of stuff basically ends up coming out of those fees. So I guess this is one way in the US where, in a weird way, poorer users are potentially subsidizing wealthier users. We might have to go to Patio 11 for a full breakdown of exactly what's going on there. But it does seem like rewards accrue to more affluent credit card users. There's not really rewards for payments in China, so that's one thing. There's also credit. When we use credit cards in the US, by and large, we're like putting it on our tab and then we pay the bill at the end of the month. When they're doing WeChat payments, there's not really a credit element. There's an actual deduction from your balance. It goes to their balance immediately, and they know that you're like good for the funds. Now, I had the impression for US credit cards that like it was the interest that you were paying on balances that was covering the risk that you might not pay, but maybe to some degree also the transaction fees are somewhat covering the risk that you might not pay. That's opaque to me. But again, that risk doesn't really exist in the Chinese context. They're just debiting your actual balance. Fraud protection, as far as I can tell, seems to be about the same. And in fact, it might even be easier there, because here we have this whole dispute the payment with your credit card rigmarole. There, you can dispute a payment directly with WeChat or directly with Alipay. And from what I understand, I never had to do this, you can often get reimbursed if there is any sort of fraudulent charge. And from what I gather, it happens much faster. It's a much more streamlined experience, where in the US, you're like waiting weeks, and the merchant can file their counterclaim, whatever. It's a mess on both sides, frankly, both the consumer and the business side. I think neither one has a great experience with credit card disputes. It sounds like it's actually a lot easier to do that kind of thing, at least on the consumer side in the Chinese context. And somehow it all adds up to dramatically lower transaction costs, such that, and I think even peer-to-peer, there might be no transaction costs, which we do have some of that in the US as well, right? If I do a Venmo to my buddy, that he gets the balance and I'm not paying an extra fee on top. So I think when I was doing this stuff at the concierge, I think there was just no money lost at all. And they were happy to do that. And that happened a couple times. I also got tickets to a soccer game one time that way, by just going up to the concierge desk and saying, "I want to go to a soccer game. I have no idea what to do. Can you help me buy tickets to a soccer game?" They ended up doing it all on their account, and then I just paid them right as they hit the checkout button for the tickets, and boom, we're good to go. I thought that was all pretty cool, and again, just makes for a great overall experience. Another interesting thing about China, I would say, is there's just really a ton of things that you see that you're like, boy, that is really similar to what we're familiar with at home. For example, the Apple aesthetic is very prominent in China. I went to a mall and went to a number of different technology company stores, including Huawei and Xiaomi. And both of these companies sell phones and laptops, and they look like exactly like iPhones. And the stores are set up exactly like Apple stores. If you walked into these things not knowing where you were, you would like definitely, if you just open your eyes, you would immediately think you're in an Apple store. You would maybe start to notice that you're not in an Apple store, obviously because the signage is in Chinese, but also because these companies both sell cars as well. So there's like, imagine an Apple store that also sells cars. Imagine if the Apple car were actually a thing. That would be the experience of going into a Xiaomi or a Huawei store. But the aesthetic is like strikingly Apple-like. Another thing that jumped out at me is that they have a similar, you might call it cult of the founder type attitude toward the leaders of their tech companies. You could maybe say like the cult of maybe Confucius is like the ultimate cult of the founder. There's still a temple to Confucius in Beijing to this day. And I was interested to learn that Confucius's direct descendants, now 79 generations on, still identify, they've tracked their lineage back to Confucius. They still identify as his direct descendants, and they still do like certain ceremonies or rituals, whatever, to honor him, I believe on his birthday. 79 generations on, that's pretty remarkable. Cult of the founder. Mao is maybe another example of the cult of the founder, in that Mao is still what cash there is, which is not much, but when I was able to get my hands on a little cash, Mao's face was on all the bills that I saw. But it also happens at the tech company level. The founder of Huawei is talked about in a sort of mythical sense. The founder of DeepSeek is talked about in this way. The founder of Jipu or Z.ai is also talked about in this way. And it very much echoed the way that people in the US, and I would say probably more positively, actually, but there's definitely a sort of parallel to the Bezos and the Zuckerberg and the Elon. Elon would be, of course, the paradigmatic example of this in the US. They really do have there's a very strong sense in which they look up to these tech founders and leaders that I think absolutely parallels our own. Going to WAIC, also just really striking. This was at the Shanghai Expo Center, and I've actually never been to CES, but I'd say in terms of scale, it was probably CES scale. Is a huge event. I did go to NVIDIA ETC conference last year, and that was like the most recent big tech conference with like these mega booths from these huge companies. And this was exactly the same kind of vibe at the Shanghai Expo Center. Again, if you just opened your eyes and you were like, where am I? You might think you were in Las Vegas at a big trade show. The booth structure, the aesthetic, like it's all very, very similar. Not really too much to speak of from the actual WAIC like trade show itself. I thought it was so familiar that in some ways it wasn't really that interesting. You saw all the big companies that you would expect to see. They had booths that showed all the things that you would expect to see them show. And it was remarkable mostly for just how similar and otherwise unremarkable it was to be on the trade show floor. One thing I was expecting, and maybe didn't see as much of as I was expecting, was like really cool robot demos. You do see more robots just out and about in China, certainly, than you do see in the United States. At one of the hotels that I stayed at, there were a couple of robots that were in use to deliver meals that were delivered by Meituan to rooms where the customer was ultimately going to receive them. So that was interesting. I also saw some robots just going around in parks, kind of sweeping robots. These were not humanoids. They were more like little R2-D2 style droids that either had a compartment to hold your food or a compartment to hold the leaves and the pine needles or whatever that were being swept up into them. Those were like pretty basic. I think they were probably programmed either to the specific space that they were in, or they were programmed with like relatively simple rules of like, go slowly, don't bump into, otherwise just kind of cover space. It was a little bit like your iRobot RIP, iRobot, things like we've had in the US, but just deployed in public places, more prominent, more visible. So you did have those kinds of robots, but they weren't particularly advanced in terms of the tasks that they were doing or the way that they were moving about. Now, back to WAIC, I did have a chance at the Tencent booth to sit for a brief robot massage. And this is the first time a robot ever touched me in any meaningful way. But I sat down in the chair and the robot put its, I guess it was doing a sort of Chinese pressure point sort of thing, where it had one hand on the front of my chest and one on the back, just kind of on the inside of the shoulder. And it did a pressure point circular massage. It was a pretty short experience. It was maybe a 1 to 2 minute demo. It felt okay. I would say I didn't get any human massages, but I would say the human massage would still be the preferable experience. But it wasn't just phoning it in. It did have like real pressure on me, and it was kind of interesting. Aside from that, though, as I walked around, there was certainly a ton of robotics companies, and one can expect that China will dominate the human, at least the sort of scaled production of all kinds of robots, including humanoid-style robots. And that humanoid could be wheeled or it could be with legs, whatever. And of course, Tesla's going to give them a run for their money. And we have other companies that are really working on the AI, the general purpose AI, to power these sorts of robots. At the Robot Expo Hall, it was a little bit weird. It was like there were so many robots and so many demos set up, but not that many demos actually working. A lot of them were paused. It was like, oh, here's a robot that's set up to cook, but it's not actually cooking. One that I saw was going to do a magic trick. And there was a guy there that was like shuffling cards, and he was the human magician. So he spoke good English and started chatting with him a little bit. And I said, so you taught this robot to do a magic trick, huh? And he's like, yeah, I did. And I said, what did that take? And he said, oh, God, it took 6 weeks of just a ton. And I did the trick over and over again. And I said, so you're not worried about robots taking your job anytime soon as a magician? He said, oh, God, no, it's a long way off. They were only going to do, from what I could tell from the signage, they were only going to do this robot magic trick demo one time. And it was like the next day at 11 a.m. or whatever. And I was like, only one time? You're only going to do this? You went to all this trouble? You're only going to show it off one time? And I couldn't figure out why that was. It's possible that I missed something, that there was maybe some rule, or they were trying to have different companies stage their demos out at different times. But I never caught any wind of that. It just seemed to me broadly that like the robot hardware is certainly coming along and people see the opportunity, and the government has said that like this is a priority, and so people are trying to answer that call. But the actual autonomy did not feel that far along yet. And this maybe suggests, and this could be something to come back to in a later episode, but I think there's maybe some opportunity for real complementarity between the Chinese ecosystem and what the American ecosystem is currently leading on. I suspect that outside of maybe Unitree, which certainly has cool robots and does some incredible demos, I suspect that the American companies are farther ahead on the actual model development for general purpose autonomy of these humanoid and other similar robot form factors. I didn't get the sense that the models on these Chinese robots were really all that good. There was some teleoperation. There was one time where I was walking down a hall and a robot was walking toward me, and I extended my hand as if to shake its hand. And then I looked up and there's a woman behind the robot controlling it with a remote control. And she looks at me and sees me and she just shakes her head like, this thing is not going to shake your hand, buddy. So I didn't really expect it to, but it was just kind of, okay, this is not an autonomous demo. This is showing that the robot can walk, but it is walking with teleop. And I think that was kind of where most of these companies were at. I didn't see much that led me to believe that they were very far along in autonomy. And just the fact that they were only going to do this magic trick demo once, it still kind of made me feel like, is this some sort of, like, what, how, is this sort of a sleight of hand within a sleight of hand? Because I felt like if you could really do that magic trick at all reliably or without some sort of really convoluted setup, you'd probably do it a few times over the course of a 4-day major event like this. But as far as I could tell, it was only going to happen the one time. To be continued, I think, on
robots, but I think there's definitely some opportunity for complementarity there. Other things that jumped out at me as like being extremely, almost uncannily similar, the Chinese hyperscalers and the role that they play in the tech ecosystem really reminds me of the role that like a Google or a Meta play in the American ecosystem. I had the opportunity, actually this was just through a LinkedIn connection. I had my local Claude before I left go through all messages that I've received on all platforms basically and say, who am I connected with in China, even just like who follows me at Chinese frontier companies. And I just sent probably 20 DMs to people that had either reached out on LinkedIn or that followed me or whatever. And one guy that had connected with me on LinkedIn works at a Chinese hyperscaler. And so I reached out and said, hey, I'm going to be in your city in Shanghai and I'd love to meet. And he said, could you come to our office for lunch? And I said, yes, I can. I'd love to do that. So I took my DiDi over there and it cost me $7 or whatever to get across town. And it was exactly like having lunch at Google. Like it was so similar. And I don't think that's an accident, right? I think they're taking inspiration from Google in many ways. But big cafeteria, bring a friend, just swipe them in. I'm not sure what kind of registration process, but I had a guest badge, swiped in, overabundance of like all kinds of different foods. Everybody just eating in big tables in the cafeteria. I've had lunch at Google a number of times over the years. It felt exactly like having lunch at Google. This was, of course, all Chinese, but an extremely similar experience at pretty much every step. And then during the lunch, I was saying, okay, so what else is going on? What do you think I should do? And the guy said, actually, tonight we have a event for startups, which you could come to if you want to come. And so again, my mindset in life, and particularly when I'm traveling, is say yes to as many invitations as possible. So, okay, let's go do that. So later on that same day, I went to this startup mixer, and it had, again, an uncannily similar structure to a mixer that a big tech company might throw in San Francisco. You got tons of founders running around. They are all pretty early stage in this context. Some of them had launched, some of them hadn't even launched. They are all like super eager to pitch you on what they're doing. They're all hustling. The big tech company is providing the space, providing the food, providing the drink. Actually, another interesting thing is that there was very little alcohol in China, in my experience. Now, that's obviously a small slice. But in the same way that people have been saying recently that alcohol is out of fashion in Silicon Valley, there wasn't a lot of alcohol at any of these AI or tech events in China either. I think I had a drink, and mostly, honestly, when I was hanging out with other Westerners from the AI safety community, like 2 times. And aside from that, there was just not much alcohol going on at all. Clean living, I would say, is also a commonality right now between the San Francisco AI scene and at least the Shanghai startup mixer that I attended. And yeah, again, you could feel so many similarities. Structurally, the way it was provided by this big tech company that wasn't selling anything or trying to get you to make any commitments to them. But if anything, they were like maybe going to give you free credits to sign up with their cloud or sign up with their AI inference product. And these folks all running around hustling. It's just like, boy, this is very much an echo of Silicon Valley. There was another instance that, again, was pretty similar. I don't know the university tech transfer dynamic in the US super well, and I obviously don't know anything in China super well, but I had an opportunity to visit what I would describe as kind of a tech transfer office that they described as sitting between academia and commercialization. They described, and I don't know to what degree this takes inspiration from Peter Thiel, but they described the technology process as going from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and 1 to 100. And 0 to 1, they said that's really at universities. That's like professors, that's research groups. They're trying to figure out what tech has any possibility of working. Then they described themselves as sitting between the researchers and the market and trying to understand both what enterprise customers want, what the market at large wants, and what the
technologists in the universities are actually getting traction on, and trying to bridge those two and helping these technologies go through this kind of cross the chasm sort of thing, if you will, this 1 to 10, where you validate that, yes, this technology probably can scale, not to actually scale it, but that it can probably scale, and that it meets the commercial needs that people have. And then once they do that, that's when a company actually gets started and spun out to go do its thing and go from 10 to 100. And again, that felt pretty similar to what I've seen in American tech transfer contexts. There were even some kind of social dynamics that I thought notably similar, and I wouldn't want to overstate this, but in the US, we have this phenomenon where women are outperforming men on educational attainment indicators. The majority of people going to college these days is women. You've got this sort of phenomenon of women feeling like, where are the eligible men that are in my same social or economic class? And that also seems to be going on in China. There's a similar phenomenon where younger women are achieving at higher rates educationally than their male peers. And at a number of the different places that I visited, the most senior person that was representing the organization was indeed a woman. Now, you don't see that necessarily all the way up the very, very highest echelons of power in Chinese society, which also you don't necessarily see it in the very, very highest echelons in American society either. But it was notable to see that there was this kind of similar thing where women are outperforming men. Where are the men that are on my level was the question that they're asking. And the women are going places. Can the men kind of keep up? It was a question, I think, in both societies right now. Definitely some differences worth noting, too. One big one is that the way things happen in China with respect to how you advance in the political system, that is very different. And I think it's actually quite important. There's something in China called the mayor economy, which certainly you can find better experts to explain than I can. But the key insight is that to advance your political career in China, you have to please the party. You have to please the higher ups. There are no local voters in general that you have to please and get their votes. So this creates quite different incentives from what we have in the US in a lot of cases. In the US, of course, if you're a mayor of a city, you are accountable to the voters of your city, and it's up to you to figure out what strategy you want to play to win support from your voters. If your voters don't like the current president, then you can get ahead by attacking the current president. If, as we saw in California with respect to Elon, there's a super successful business person in your jurisdiction, but you think you can make political hay by attacking that person, you can do that. And maybe if they're Elon, they might leave, but maybe that still redounds to your benefit. Maybe you have a voter base in your particular area that supports you for speaking truth to power or whatever, however they would see that. In China, it's very different in this respect. If you are the mayor of a local city, you are essentially in competition with the mayors of other cities to prove that you are the best at running a local city government and, to some extent, the economy. And of course, there's a tremendous market activity in China. So this is not a command and control. And hopefully that's been clear from everything I've said so far. It is hyper capitalist and hyper competitive in some ways. But the local political leadership sees itself in competition with other similar level people. And the people they have to please are above them. There are no voters. They want to make the citizens successful and prosperous, but it's doing that that will get them the approval and the promotions from the people higher up in the party. And so I do think that creates quite a different dynamic where obviously you're never going to have local officials trashing the national officials. That is probably obvious. But also, I would say the relationship between government and local businesses is also quite different, where the local mayors or whatever kind of local officials we're talking about, they want to see their local companies succeed. And so they're investing in them. They're trying to help them in whatever ways they can. They want their local electronic vehicle maker or their local robotics maker to be one of the ones that ultimately survives. And you'll have this sort of the way that technology proliferates in the US. In some ways, you could draw an analogy. Like I tell the story all the time of how cable companies happened in the US. It happened in one place, and then people said, hey, that's a pretty good business model. I'll go start up the cable company in my city. And so initially, we had just a huge number of cable companies, and we still do have quite a lot, but there's been a lot of consolidation over time. There's something kind of similar that happens in China where it's more often like a kind of strategic directive that like, hey, we need to lead in electronic vehicles. We need to lead in humanoid robotics. This is important. Okay, that message goes out, and now it's entrepreneurs that start these companies, but it's also the mayors of the cities or the provincial leadership, whatever, that is also thinking, okay, I want to get promoted. The big man says electronic vehicles and humanoid robots are really important. How can I help my local companies succeed? If I can do that, that's going to be a major feather in my cap. That's the kind of thing that's going to get me promoted. And so the incentives for local leadership, I think, are very different, and in some ways more pro-business than they are in the United States. Of course, we do have incentives for local leaders to support local business in the US as well, but I think it's a little more complicated. When you look at like what Mamdani is doing in New York, his rhetoric is not super friendly to some of the biggest taxpayers in his jurisdiction, right? I wouldn't say anybody thinks he's a great friend to finance. He's not necessarily attacking finance as much as you might suspect based on some of his other democratic socialist principles or pronouncements, but he's certainly not like championing finance either, even though it's a huge taxpayer and it's just a major industry in New York. I think and again, tell me if you think I'm wrong, correct me in the comments, but I think the mayor economy creates a more supportive business environment because people know that the competition is going to be intense. It is not the case that you have, with maybe some exceptions in the older state-owned enterprises. But these days, when China wants to enter in a new industry, it is doing it with private sector innovation, and the local political leadership knows that this is happening all over the country, and most of these companies are not going to make it. So if we want ours to make it, we better do our part to support them. And that did feel like a quite different vibe from what I was able to learn from the American context. Another funny thing was just in terms of surprises and also like notable differences, an unbelievable number of generally remarkably clean public toilets in especially Beijing, but I think in major cities throughout China. This was something that the national government decided was a priority at some point, or at least one of their priorities. And so they've built a lot of clean public toilets. In Beijing in particular, I was just astounded by how often you are passing a public toilet. And when I used them, they were really quite clean. And I was like, and there was no fee or anything attached, just public toilets available everywhere, clean, ready to go. That is obviously not the case in a New York or San Francisco. You got to find a business that you want to make a token purchase from or whatever if you're going to use their bathroom in many cases. In Beijing, and again, I think in most of China, but in Beijing to an amazing degree, there were just a huge number of public toilets always available. Another big difference, of course, is like surveillance. They do have, it's obvious, I think, to everybody that there's just a huge number of cameras around all the time, indoors and outdoors. Even sitting in a restaurant, you look around and there's like multiple cameras covering the inside of restaurants. They're covering the outside on the street. Basically, anywhere that you go that's not like your own private room, you should assume that you're on camera. And on top of that, you also, especially as an international visitor, you need to bring your passport to a lot of things. To take a train, the high-speed train required check-in with the passport. Going to the Forbidden City required check-in with the passport. Going to parks, even just public parks, seemed to, in some cases, require a passport, or in some cases they maybe said they did, but they didn't always. But there were fees, small fees for public parks in many places, which I found to be surprising. truly like very small fees, like 2 yuan or whatever. This would be 30 cents, something along those lines, basically a nominal fee. And then I also noticed that if you wanted the annual pass, it was only like a small multiple of that. So you could get the annual subscription or the annual pass to parks for $1 or $2. But why were they even charging at all? I wasn't really sure. One theory was that this was just another way that you can track people. If they are going to enter the park, you know who paid what and when, and so you know who's entering the park. I'm not sure if that's really the right answer. Maybe it was just for revenue. They certainly keep things very clean. There were a lot of people sweeping the streets. Again, especially in Beijing, I was really amazed by how many people I saw sweeping sidewalks, sweeping the park areas, keeping the public bathrooms clean. And obviously that has to be paid for somehow. So maybe the park revenue is going to that. It didn't seem like they were charging enough to really cover that. So I'm not sure that's really the right answer. But yeah, you're just it's clear that as you go through life, you are like being watched and you are also being logged at all these different touch points. The upside of this is that it is incredibly safe. You have basically no worry. The attitude there is like there's no crime in China. That's pretty much how people approach it. And I certainly felt totally safe. I've also heard from women and from families that it's very comfortable to be out at night as a woman in a way that it's not so comfortable in New York City. Or with kids, you can take your kids anywhere, kids at any time of night. I went to one section of Beijing fairly late at night. It was like 11 o'clock, and there were just tons of kids out. And I felt that in Mexico before as well, supposedly dangerous Mexico. And certainly Mexico does have some dangerous parts. But you go to a small town in Mexico and kids are out late at night in the public square. And China has a similar vibe. It just feels like you're safe wherever you go. This is also super useful if you do lose your phone. I heard multiple stories of people leaving a phone in a cab. And this can be a huge problem if everything is on the phone, right? I was kind of thinking, man, in the end, I did take a computer, which I didn't really need and I never really used, but I just wanted to have some other device that I could use if I lost the phone. So I had recently replaced my laptop. I wiped the old laptop, took it back to factory settings, and basically just took this clean laptop just to have this backup device. But what I heard from multiple people multiple times was, oh, I left a phone in a cab. I went immediately to the police. There's a lot of these little police touch points around the way. So I went immediately to the police. I told them what happened. They pull up the security camera footage. They're able to say, you point to where you were, or you should maybe show on a map where you were. They're able to get a visual of you getting out of the cab very quickly. They're able to then see the license plate on the car that you were in. The information integration is such that they can then identify who's driving that car. They can call that person's phone number and say, hey, your previous passenger left a phone in the car. We need you to bring it back. And people get their phones back seemingly like within an hour, maybe an hour or two, with almost perfect reliability. I actually did not hear of a story of anybody leaving a phone in a cab and failing to get it back. I heard multiple stories of how quick and easy it was to get it back going to the police. So this was pretty impressive. And obviously this surveillance does create some downside risk potential as well. Prakash and I on AI on the AM had a whole discussion not too long ago about how if we move to mass surveillance with our current laws, or at least our current policing environment, our current enforcement environment is premised on the idea that not everything is going to be investigated. Not every break of the law that happens is going to be prosecuted. That somehow flips because all of a sudden AI is reviewing and surveilling everything and reviewing all the documents and putting two and two together, that we're going to be in a weird place where people had the expectation that this was all kind of loose and suddenly it becomes tight. In China, it's pretty tight. The expectation is that you are being watched, that you don't have digital privacy, and the result is that crime is low. The potential for abuse, I think, is pretty high. But from what I saw as of now, it seems to be working. I think there is definitely, one way to model what is happening there in terms of risk is that they may be putting a lot of risk into the future. One question that I asked people multiple times is what happens when
President Xi retires, or what would happen if he were to suddenly die. And basically, as of now, nobody has any idea. There's no successor that anybody can identify. There could be a real power struggle. Obviously, the apparatus that they've created and the ability to surveil people, if there was a power struggle, or if there was dissent or whatever, the potential for abuse could be like extremely high. I think it's already, you don't step out of line, right? So as of now, things are under control and people are playing by the rules. There's not too many people that are stepping out. And so there's not too much need to abuse. It's all under control. But this does, I think, create significant risk for the future if things were to go haywire. But for now, it's working quite well and the experience is really good and you feel safe and you feel like you're not getting ripped off. Your guard is down. I would say my guard was, I love traveling. I love going to different places and I'm not concerned about it being a little bit dangerous. I went to Brazil the last 2 summers. People would say all the time, oh, it's dangerous. You got to be careful. You can't take your phone out on the street. And sometimes I did. But there's a lot of phone theft that goes on in Brazil. They, by the way, are also introducing more and more network style surveillance to try to tamp that down. It does seem to be working. I actually visited the police station in Sao Paulo as part of a walking tour that I did one day there. And it's quite China-like. And it does seem to be really having an impact. It does seem to be moving the needle on crime statistics from what I've read. This is something that with AI able to review all the tape and AI able to put 2 and 2 together and all the facial recognition and just how scalable all this stuff is becoming, I think this is something that all societies are going to have to figure out where they want to land on the spectrum of how much surveillance versus anonymity versus freedom, et cetera. But China has definitely picked its place. And for now, I think it is working for them. You can go around with a very comfortable feeling. What happens in the future, if something changes, I think is a serious risk. But for now, it's a pretty awesome experience. Okay, almost to the end for today. One observation that I made that somebody said, that's an astute observation, so I thought I would relay it to you, is that in some ways, Chinese society is a little bit more comfortable with contradiction than I am used to. I think, speaking for myself, but I think in a representative way of Western thought, when we see contradictions, we feel like they need to be resolved, where they need to be interrogated, they need to be taken apart. We want consistency. We want logical consistency and coherence in our systems, in our account of why things are happening the way they're happening. In China, I've noticed a few different ways where that didn't necessarily seem to be a requirement. One of the things is when it comes to religion, it's like people participate in multiple religions. They don't really seem to see a contradiction in it. You have people that'll participate in like Christian and Buddhist stuff and like consider themselves atheist all at the same time. And it's fine. Even though some of these religions are maybe, especially the Christian religion, is meant to exclude participation in others, they don't seem to mind blurring those lines. I'm also reminded of a China Talk episode that I cross-posted, actually. The title of the episode is a U.S.-China Thucydides Trap Unavoidable? And this is from a China Talk cross-post with Professor David Kang. This is from a little over a year ago in April 25. And one of the interesting points that I remember being made in that episode was that the whole China-Taiwan thing, part of the struggle kind of comes from the fact that everybody now is living in this Westphalian paradigm where nation states are a binary thing. Either you are one or you aren't one. And you have these very particular criteria that make you one. And if you're not one, then you're not one. And you're either sovereign or you're not. And the argument that the guest on that episode made was like, if that paradigm hadn't been imposed by Western thought on the world as a whole, and it was just left to Chinese people across China and Taiwan to figure out their relationship, you might see something different emerge where there's a, contradictory understanding where we could say, yeah, we're independent, but we're like part of China. There's kind of one China. We'll pay a tribute to you, or we recognize that you're the prime power in the region, but we also have our own thing going. And that might be okay. And it does seem like there is reason to believe this in a bunch of different ways, that there's just a little bit greater comfort with this
a sense of contradiction that for Westerners, I think is uncomfortable. Other examples of that are just VPNs. It's illegal to use a VPN, but everybody does it. And not only does everybody do it, now everybody, the people that I met with all do it, right? And you might have noticed, of course, there's a lot of Chinese people on Twitter, a lot in the AI space. Like, how are all these Chinese AI researchers at Chinese companies on Twitter if Twitter is blocked by the Great Firewall? The answer is they use VPNs. Even though it's technically illegal, it's accepted to the point of being commonplace, and companies even provide them in some cases. They have a company VPN that they can use that is official. It's officially provided by the company to them. So it's not just random one-off people downloading apps and circumventing the rules. It's like the company is giving you a VPN, and this is a fairly well-known company. So what's up with that? People are not worried about getting busted for their VPNs. That was like, they're very comfortable with it, open with it, never heard of anybody getting into trouble. Somebody said it would be like getting struck by lightning. They were like, has it happened? Could it happen? Yeah, somebody maybe could be made an example of if they stepped out in some other way, but it's fine. They were not worried about it at all. And similarly, on the censorship point, there was this notion several times that I heard where it was like people were sort of decrying the censorship regime, complaining about it. Also, all the while, they were like getting around it via VPN. But then in the next breath, they would say, but it is kind of necessary, or there are good reasons for it because we wouldn't want the whole Chinese public. People aren't so educated. You're talking to me. I'm a worldly person. I've spent time outside the country. I can handle this access to information. And so it's annoying to me that I'm officially denied it and I have to go through this VPN thing, but I do that and I'm also not worried about being caught. But I'm also, maybe I don't think they would necessarily go as far as saying they're glad that other Chinese people don't have the same access, but definitely they feel like they can understand why the government is not giving the same unfettered access to everyone. Because maybe not everybody can handle, or not everybody would be able to properly interpret or contextualize these more sensitive stories that they themselves would not want to be unable to access. Kind of strange, paternalistic, something that everybody that I spoke to, not everybody, I'm not sure everybody wanted to defend the censorship, but certainly it was like multiple voices said, yeah, I kind of do see why some of this stuff exists. We wouldn't want to cause panic among the broader population. Two other examples of this like comfort with contradictions thing real quickly. You may have heard that there's an emphasis on the low altitude, AKA drone economy in China. Okay, that's cool, but drones are also banned in Beijing. And there was one university professor that I was talking to over lunch at one point who was pretty freely criticizing this policy, not dissenting at the macro level from the government's legitimacy, but basically saying, just pointing out some weird contradictions and saying how it was silly. And he was very comfortable speaking about that. But it was like, we're trying to promote this technology, but we've banned it in the capital. And there was some kind of weird catch-22 thing where he already had a drone when the ban was introduced. And then it became illegal to have the drone, but you have to get your permit for the drone before you can have it. And he already had it, so he couldn't get the permit. It was you can only fly it outside of Beijing. But for him to take it out, there was like some issue where he catch-22 wise couldn't get the right permit. And so he was just freely saying, this is just ridiculous. But also again, in the next breath, like, but I do understand why we might not want to have drones flying all over the capital. We got a lot of sensitive stuff there and blah, 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 blah. Finally, there's just this also really long-standing combination or mix of an extreme commitment to fairness with a long history of corruption. This goes back a long way. At the Imperial College Museum, one of the more interesting exhibits I saw the entire time was a museum of the history of the civil service exam, which you probably know, goes back a long time. They have for many centuries in China chosen the civil service members via this really difficult exam that people studied for years for, and like a vanishingly small percentage of people actually managed to pass all the way through to get into these very coveted positions. But one of the reasons so this is extreme fairness, and they would go to these lengths in terms of ensuring the fairness of the exams. A couple of details were like, you had to sleep in basically a little prison cell kind of thing to take the exam. You would go into the cell. You would be in there for 3 days at a time. The exam itself took 9 days, but you would have 3-day periods. Then you would be able to leave for a day and come back. During those 3 days, you're in your little cell by yourself. Your exam materials are in there. You're cooking your own food over a little personal flame that you have in there, and you're using the bathroom in a pot in your own little cell. They had a replica of one of these cells. And this was all to ensure that the exam was fair. They even at some points in time would have scribes individuals' exams so that the examiners couldn't recognize handwriting. That's how much of a commitment to fairness and how much of an investment in making the exam fair they've been going to for literally hundreds of years. But then again, part of the reason that these positions were so coveted was that then there were opportunities for corruption. So a sort of strange juxtaposition of fairness and rectitude in the selection of these civil servants with kind of the expectation that they might also be a little bit corrupt on the back end. Strange. There's all societies, of course, contain their contradictions. I don't think this is totally unique to China, but it did seem like the comfort with it and the willingness to leave some of these things in tension as opposed to feeling the need to fully resolve them felt a little bit noticeable to me as a foreign observer. And I do think that gives you some wiggle room, right? Why do I even bring that up? In the next couple episodes, when we get into things, especially around US-China relations, I think that this comfort with ambiguity or this lack of a need to resolve everything to the point where it's fully coherent or fully consistent, I think that can give some wiggle room. We have this a little bit too with our strategic ambiguity around Taiwan, but I think there's room for kind of multiple truths to exist in superposition in the Chinese system that also gives them some wiggle room to make deals with us that, you know, on the face of it, if you assumed or insisted that everything's going to be fully logical, fully consistent, that might not be possible in the same way. Okay, final section for now, attitudes on AI. Of course, I talked to a lot of people that are in the AI space, but for the moment, I'm going to talk about kind of attitudes of people that are like somewhat outside of the core AI community. I hired one tour guide the entire time I was there. It was at the Forbidden City. This woman came up to me and just kind of made her pitch that I should hire her as a tour guide. And I really liked her vibe. She just seemed to have a good kind of fun attitude, and she spoke pretty good English. And I said, you know what? I haven't done this on any other site. You're on. Let's do it. Naturally, I had got my historical context from AIs. I decided I might get some perspective on AI from my human tour guide. So I asked her a bunch of stuff. I told her what I do and to the best of my ability to make it clear what it is that I do, which is not always clear to people who I can speak to in native English either. I tell them, like, I'm a full-time student of AI. I'm an industry analyst. I'm an AI scout. What are these things? Nobody really knows. I'm a podcaster. I have 10 part-time jobs. I say all those sorts of things. But when she understood that I worked in AI, her immediate reaction was to kind of light up and be like, oh, it's a good job. It's a good job. So she was very much cognizant of this is where the action is. This is where the energy is. People are making money in this space. And she was enthused and excited for me. It seemed like that I was in the AI space. When it came to her use of AI, one of the more interesting things that I heard the entire time, honestly, was about the AI Doubao. Doubao is from ByteDance, the same company that makes TikTok. And Doubao is, as far as I can tell, the most broadly diffused AI in Chinese society. A couple of people actually said the excitement about DeepSeek is way more popular in the West than it is in Chinese society. Somebody also said, like, the QN models, nobody in China uses them, certainly not at the retail level. They're popular for fine tuning and for cost efficiency among Western startups, but the attitude that I heard about the QN models was like, we don't really use those in China. What do people use? They use Doubao. Something like 150 million users. And it's a very voice native thing. It's very sort of companion. And people really seem to like it. If you're outside of China, you can't use Doubao. They have another version called Dola, which is the international version, in the same way that like Douyin was the original, native Chinese TikTok, and then TikTok is actually the international product. They have a similar thing going with Doubao and Dola, but you can't even get Dola in the US. So when I was on my international carrier roaming plan,
to go through the App Store, I register as being in the US. Dole is not available in the US. Actually, one of the few times I had to turn my VPN on was to make it look like I was in Singapore or whatever, so I could download Dola, so I could experience this Doubao thing that everybody was talking about. I didn't end up using it very much because it was too much of a rigmarole, and the VPN seemed to slow my connection down in general. But I did manage to actually get in there a little bit and have a little bit of a conversation with Doubao. Doubao is like it's the sort of maybe the closest thing to ChatGPT in the sense that it's the thing that tons of people are using for free. It's maybe the sort of Facebook in the sense that it's the thing that the boomers are using. I heard a couple people tell me who are maybe in their late 20s or 30s that their parents use Doubao. And 2 women actually said that their moms had made some comment to them like, look at what Doubao said to me. Why can't you be so nice and sweet to me like Doubao is? So there's definitely like a companionship element to it. And this tour guide woman at the Forbidden City said, well, in Chinese society, there's some things you can't really talk about with anybody, but you can talk about those things with Doubao and nobody will judge you. Doubao won't judge you. And I was like, what kind of things are we talking about? And she said, maybe you have a boyfriend, for example, and you decide you don't like that boyfriend anymore. You want to change your boyfriend or whatever. That's the kind of thing that you would talk to Doubao about. And I said, what would you have done in the past with no Doubao? And she said, nah, just keep it to yourself. I have no idea how representative that is, but it was interesting. And it was interesting that she found a lot of value in Doubao and that it seems like that's a pretty common thing. And I also heard this, nobody will judge you, both in the sense that Doubao itself will not judge you, but also that people will not judge you for using Doubao. The idea that you have some sort of emotional connection or you get emotional support or you have a real relationship, real being whatever you want to mean by real, with Doubao, that seemed to be tolerated, accepted, understood as kind of an increasingly normal part of society, even among people of various age groups. This was not just young people. It was like young people's parents that are doing this. So I thought that was like really quite interesting. Nevertheless, there's also some reason to believe that the enthusiasm for AI that we often talk about in the West, where we're like, oh, we in the West are like pessimistic about AI, China's more optimistic. I think that's true, but it might be overstated a bit. Several people said in an economic sense, people are not that confident in the economy. They are worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about being outcompeted. And to some degree, they're running to AI on the kind of famous rationale that it won't be AI that replaces you. It'll be somebody using AI that'll replace you. And so if you want to be secure economically, you've got to be a good early adopter of AI. So there's some sense that some of the survey data or whatever that shows enthusiasm about AI might be capturing this kind of run to the thing that you're afraid that other people will use better than you if you don't get on it quickly. And that may cause some of the sentiment, some of the pro-AI sentiment to be overstated. I did hear one story about a DiDi driver, in other words, an Uber driver, who used to be a software engineer, but lost his job for AI reasons and is now driving an Uber or a DiDi, in fact. Was that even a real story? I don't know. I heard that in English from a seemingly credible source, but I think if nothing else, it reflects a certain amount of economic anxiety or sense of insecurity, sense that the economy is not that good. Nobody's starving in China, obviously, these days. So it's not like a total panic fear of losing one's job, but nobody wants to lose their job. And people do feel that the way to get ahead is to adopt. Maybe just a couple little final points. Diffusion has been discussed a lot, right? Which country has the better ability to diffuse? And there was this story of OpenClaw going viral in China. From what I saw, OpenClaw was not super deeply penetrated into Chinese society. But what is happening is diffusion via the platforms. And this is, again, somewhat similar to what we have with Google, right? How do most people use AI most of the time? Arguably, the number one thing might just be that you get AI summaries coming up in search.
And it's now integrated into Gmail, and you've got it now on Facebook and all their surfaces. So even if you're like not seeking it out or trying to do anything really, it's coming to you via the platforms. And that is happening in China as well, but even to a, I would say, potentially much more transformative degree. Maybe a little slower in some ways, but I think potentially quite a bit more powerful when it does happen. WeChat is working on their agent. There is not, and this is also creating all kinds of tensions and competitive dynamics among the Chinese tech companies. I believe it was ByteDance that created an agent that was an attempt to be like the super agent that would sit on top of all the super apps, and that would include the ability to use WeChat for you. But then WeChat blocked it. WeChat in turn is trying to create its own agent, which will be native to WeChat. And because WeChat is so ubiquitous and literally everyone and everything is on it, and you can book appointments on it, you can pay for things on it, the degree to which you can really run your life out of WeChat is not really matched by any app in the West. There's no super app that has the ubiquity and the depth of services all in one place that WeChat has. So I didn't get a chance to use it, but they are in the beta, semi-public, semi-private, whatever, beta test stage of the WeChat agent. And this is expected to be a huge deal because since you can do everything in WeChat, your agent is just naturally going to have access to your accounts, access to your context, ability to do things with your money, ability to make appointments that really exceeds anything that we have out of the box here in the US. There's no single service that you could add an agent to that would give you the kind of Swiss Army knife into real society that WeChat and its agent is going to give its users. So I think the WeChat agent launch, which I think is coming up pretty soon because it does sound like they're in pretty late stage testing, might be one of the most important agent launches in history, because I think it's going to have the opportunity to serve, and we'll see if they can actually, compute. This is compute analysis and what should be done about things like export controls and whatever. We'll save that for a future episode. It's not entirely clear to me that they're going to be able to serve 1 billion plus users right out of the gate with the compute resources they have. And maybe that's part of the reason that it's not already launched. I'm really not sure. We'll have to kind of wait and see. I heard conflicting reports about the degree to which companies can scale usage, but certainly going to 1 billion plus users, that's not going to be a trivial amount of compute, even for a giant like Tencent. But that agent is coming soon, and I think it will potentially be the sort of switch flip that brings AI to, basically the whole Chinese public in a really useful way that will take us a long time to catch up with in the West. Because we just don't have anything that has that kind of integration and that kind of reach. When they turn that on for everybody, it's going to be another major step up in the quality of the user experience and the things that you can do. And as far as I know, literally everyone is on that app. So I think that's definitely something to watch for. The WeChat agent coming, not exactly sure, but can't be too much longer, is going to be a huge deal. They also have some interesting things when it even comes to medicine. The Ant Group has an AI doctor. Ant Group is the company that does Alipay. And so they're making huge amounts of money. Even with their super low transaction fees, they're making huge amounts of money just by processing ungodly amounts of transactions throughout China. And what are they doing with their profits? One of the things they're doing is building an AI doctor. There is a lot of concern about the aging population in China. Multiple times I heard people talk about the hope that robots might help take care of seniors. This was discussed both in the context of a young person talking to their parents about their future and what kind of care and support the parents were going to need and who was going to provide it, maybe a robot. It was also certainly something that came up in the robot exhibition hall. And in the context of medicine too, there's a huge question of where are all the doctors going to come from to take care of these aging people? They've had the one-child policy has been over for quite some time now, but they've basically had 2 full generations of one child, either because of policy or just because it had kind of become the norm. And what that means is you've got 4 grandparents and 2 parents that only have
the one kid, or for the grandparents, they only have the one grandkid. So each kind of young person today, with exceptions, of course, because there are families that have more than one kid. But for the most part, most people you meet in their teens and their 20s and their 30s, they're the only child and they're the only grandchild for all of their grandparents. And that is a pretty profound thing, right? That's going to be a big inverted pyramid for these people to support. How are you going to support 4 grandparents as one grandkid? That's a lot to take on. So we need robots, we need AI doctors. Ant Group, this is the kind of thing that they're investing in with the enormous profits that they have. And their AI doctor very much echoes the sort of AI doctor spirit that we're seeing from ChatGPT and from Claude to some extent as well, and from Gemini too. It's free. They're really concerned about reliability. They're really concerned about not wanting to position themselves as replacing or competing with doctors, but as a resource that both serves the doctors and serves the people and hopefully makes everything better, all in a very non-threatening way, all with lots of disclaimers, all with lots of points about make sure you double check this with your human, and this, we can't prescribe you medicine, but we can hopefully guide you. All these very, very similar echoes of how things have happened in the West thus far with respect to AI doctors. So, and again, that comes available from Ant Group, which has Alipay, which is installed on just about everybody's phone. So this is something that they can kind of push to an incredibly mass audience if they choose to, when they feel that it's ready, in a way that I think is not impossible to replicate in the West, because we certainly do have apps that have very deep penetration. But the ubiquity of these things in China just allows them to push on the diffusion lever in a way that I think is going to be kind of hard for us to replicate. And so that'll definitely be very interesting to watch. The WeChat agent launch in particular, I think, is going to be a big moment. I think for today, that is plenty. I've been at it for a long time. And if you've listened this far, you've heard a lot about China. I would definitely encourage you to learn more about China through other more credible and expert sources than me. And I would suggest, for example, China Talk, which I've been a long time listener of and cross-poster of, the Sinica podcast with Kaiser Go, whose name I'm hopefully saying close enough to right. I'm really not good with the tonality of Chinese words and names, but I've been a huge fan of the Sinica podcast for years as well. I picked up another few podcasts on this trip that I would recommend, a few Chinese history ones, which were pretty cool to listen to if you're like interested in that angle. The China History podcast and the History of China, those were both informative. When I took my ride up to the Great Wall, I just searched in those two history feeds for the Great Wall. And I had a couple podcasts that I listened to on the 90-minute ride to the Great Wall, which gave me a really good historical background context for what I was about to see. I think that's just a great travel tip in general. But two other ones that I would recommend: Empires, which is a really different kind of podcast. It's like a semi-dramatization, somewhat of a fictionalization. They create multiple voices. There's sort of a narrator that tells you some of the story, but then also there's like the voices of key individuals in the story. And they do 5-episode series about major Asian companies, not just in China, but some in China, some in other Asian countries. So I listened to one on Huawei. Really interesting history. You can hear the voice, quote unquote, of the founder. It's not the real founder's voice, but they say, of course, we don't know exactly what they said or felt in those moments, but it's all based on research. And I found that to be both entertaining and quite educational. And then I also really like the podcast Ascent, which is by two women who do deep dives into Chinese businesses and their history and their strategy and their current market position and product lines. And it's a mix of history of business, but also business strategy. That's Ascent, ASCENT. And there's quite a few good ones on that as well. I think that's part of where I learned how much respect and admiration the founders of these big Chinese companies have earned, because you can definitely hear that in that particular podcast. And again, it's very educational. So, of course, there's many more resources than that, but those are just some of the few that I used in preparation and during this trip. The next two episodes that I'm going to try to do, again, are going to be a deeper dive into the state of AI safety and governance in China. And then the third one will be about the relationship between the US and China, how I understand the Chinese perspective on that relationship, having spent a couple weeks there, and again, what might be prudent for us to do on the Western side of the relationship as things get real fast. Thank you for being part of the Cognitive Revolution.
Came in on the red-eye flight, held up my little square of light. One machine told another, he's alright. Open doors like they'd known me all my life. 1 week, you know it all. 1 month, you know a little. 1 year, you don't know a thing, but everything works. Everything works. They're selling tomorrow and a brand new car. Saint on the wall, keeping watch on who you are. I swear I never once been half this far, but I know this song by heart. 1 week, you know it all. 1 month, you know a little. 1 year, you don't know a thing, but everything works. Everything works. I reached up to shake a robot's hand, a human smile. You don't understand. Some things you can't tell your mother, some things you can't tell a friend. So smile at the eye in the corner, hope it likes what it sees. They taught one sleight of hand, and Doubao says you can always tell me. 1 week, you know it all. 1 month, you know a little. 1 year, you don't know a thing, but everything works. Everything works. The moon on the far side of morning is the same old moon from home, and everything works. Everything works.
If you're finding value in the show, we'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to share it with friends, post online, write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or just leave us a comment on YouTube. Of course, we always welcome your feedback, guest and topic suggestions, and sponsorship inquiries, either via our website, cognitiverevolution.ai, or by DMing me on your favorite social network. The Cognitive Revolution is part of the Turpentine Network, a network of podcasts which is now part of A16Z, where experts talk technology, business, economics, geopolitics, culture, and more. We're produced by AI Podcasting. If you're looking for podcast production help for everything from the moment you stop recording to the moment your audience starts listening, check them out and see my endorsement at aipodcast.ing. And thank you to everyone who listens for being part of the Cognitive Revolution.